There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
A while back, I had the pleasure of participating in a panel hosted by WIC TV, the topic being whether or not male spaces are being eroded in today's day and age. And, naturally, the subject of the Boy Scouts of America came up, namely how in 2019, the organization made the decision to allow girls to join, and, earlier this year, officially changed its name to Scouting America. I am sure many of you have seen the hubbub that came about as a result of these decisions, with many conservative outlets lamenting the push by progressives to infect one of the last remaining bastions of male camaraderie with their feminist agenda, or something. And naturally, after doing about 10 minutes of research, you will come to see that this narrative is utterly false. Now, I want to make clear that this video is not meant to make a case for this change one way or the other. You may finish this video and still believe that the BSA letting girls join shouldn't have happened. I simply want to give you the proper context as to how it all came about. First, it is important that we establish the relationship between the BSA and the GSA, the Girl Scouts of America. Namely, that they are completely separate entities. Yes, they have partnered with one another over the years, but it's not like they are two separate branches of a parent company with joint oversight and/or management. They are completely unaffiliated, with different priorities, programming, and even merit badge structure. This is vital to understand, since one of the main retorts against forcing the BSA to allow girls is that it isn't fair that the GSA wasn't forced to allow boys, thus demonstrating gender bias. Which is really ironic, considering, for one, the BSA wasn't forced to do anything, we'll get to that later, but two, it was the GSA themselves that were the most irate about this change. So much so that the GSA sued the BSA for trademark infringement.
What?
While the organization itself is called the Boy Scouts of America, the Boy Scouts is also the name of their flagship program for scouts aged 11 to 17, and was rebranded as Scouts BSA following the decision to allow girls to join. The suit that the GSA filed argued that this would lead to confusion, with parents assuming the two had merged and/or that the GSA no longer exists, thus negatively impacting enrollment. In fact, the more you look into this, I think you will come away with the impression that both the BSA's decision to allow girls to join and specifically the flagship program's name change were at least partially done as a deliberate diss to the GSA. I don't have any firm evidence of this, it just feels like there's some bad blood somewhere in the mix. Right about now, you may be wondering why the GSA would have to worry about the BSA siphoning their membership, or why the GSA didn't counter by letting boys into their organization. And that is because for years, both Girl Scouts and parents have lamented that the GSA's curriculum simply isn't up to par with the BSA's. While there is a misconception that the Girl Scouts never do outdoorsy stuff and just make friendship bracelets and sell cookies and shit, there is a divergence in regard to each group's primary focus. The BSA putting more emphasis on survival activities and individualism, while the GSA focuses more on community service and selling cookies and shit. Obviously there is an overlap, and I don't think one is inherently better than the other, but there are notable differences. In addition to the fact that many observed that the BSA was simply more well organized and structured in regard to their activities and curriculum. This is why it's important to understand that the BSA and the GSA are not affiliated. For those who would ask, why open up the BSA to girls when they can just join the GSA? That's like saying you want pizza for lunch and someone saying, well, why don't you just go to the burger joint instead? They are not offering the same product, or, in this case, the same experience. Now you might say, well, why didn't the GSA just try to accommodate those who are not satisfied with their offerings? I am sure they are asking themselves that very question as we speak. To be fair, over the years the GSA has made efforts to update their curriculum, adding STEM-focused programs, for example, but it seems as if it was too little, too late. As of today, there are over 175,000 female members of Scouting America, so it seems like the BSA ultimately came out on top. This is another misconception, that the BSA was forced or pressured to allow girls in by some progressive group threatening litigation, which is probably the narrative you will hear from many conservative outlets. However, the only suits I could find in relation to girls being excluded from the BSA were from the 1990s. There were only two, neither were put forth by any specific group, but rather individuals, and both were ruled in BSA's favor. It wasn't like the girls who were unsatisfied with the GSA banded together and demanded that the BSA let them in or anything. But if not the girls themselves, surely their parents must have requested that the BSA allow girls in, right? And that is correct. In fact, this had been a request made by many parents over the years. However, rather than it being as a result of insidious feminist ideology seeping its way into broader culture, it mostly came down to convenience and logistics. Once again, the BSA and the GSA are not affiliated, and thus don't fully coordinate with each other, which means different programs, different oversight, and, notably, different scheduling. So if you were a parent trying to juggle work and errands who had a boy and girl both in Scouts, you'd have to coordinate between two completely separate activity plans. Imagine having to drop your kids off at different babysitters who live on opposite sides of town and who have different schedules you have to work around. Eventually, you'd probably just go to one of the babysitters and ask if they could watch both of your kids, right? That's basically what led to many parents requesting the change. It wasn't a cabal of blue-haired SJWs screeching for equality, but more than likely just busy, stressed-out parents trying to make their lives a little easier. Basically, it came down to the BSA reading the room in a sense. They saw an opportunity to boost their enrollment numbers and make a lot of parents happy in the process, and also maybe stick it to the GSA a bit, so they went ahead and took it. But also, just to address the elephant in the room, the decision to allow girls into the BSA just so happened to roughly coincide with them being hit with one of the largest sexual abuse settlements in history with over 92,000 claims. It's frankly staggering that the BSA is even still a thing, given the preponderance of sexual abuse throughout its history. In 1991, the Washington Times published a series that featured reports of close to 1,200 victims of abuse throughout the 1970s and 80s. In 2012, the BSA was forced to turn over a series of records they had kept of every single staff member who committed a sexual offense against Scouts since the 1920s. These records were internally referred to as the ineligible volunteer files, but colloquially known as the perversion files.
What?
In 1988, the BSA implemented their Youth Protection Program, which set out to prevent further abuse, though the brand never fully recovered, the Scouts' association with sexual abuse being cemented in culture. I remember as a kid watching SNL's 1994 Canteen Boy sketch, in which Alec Baldwin plays a Scout leader who tries to seduce a Scout played by Adam Sandler, which in retrospect is one of the most out-of-pocket things I've ever seen aired on basic cable, along with Cop Rock. I actually think that SNL has scrubbed this sketch from any streaming services, although I'm pretty sure it's on the Best of Alec Baldwin compilation DVD, which is where I'm pretty sure I saw it. However, as to who in my family bought the Best of Alec Baldwin compilation DVD, I haven't the slightest. Then, of course, there was the 2001 South Park episode, Cripple Fight, in which the character of Big Gay Al is fired as a Scoutmaster due to the fact that, spoiler alert, he's gay. As the higher-ups believe, this means he may molest the kids, only for the super hardcore macho dude they replace him with to turn around and immediately start molesting the kids. This episode was in response to the previous year's Boy Scouts of America versus Dale. The case was initiated after 19-year-old James Dale, who had been in the Scouts for over a decade, was banned from further participation after the organization learned that he was gay. It went all the way to the Supreme Court who, in a 5-4 vote, upheld the BSA's constitutional right to ban homosexual members or staff. This is something else many might not be aware of. While I'd venture to guess most who are not that familiar with the BSA wouldn't consider it an overtly religious sort of thing, not only does its literature feature some pretty blunt religious text, but historically it's been primarily sponsored by faith-based institutions. In fact, not only was the Mormon Church the very first sponsor of the Scouts back in 1913, but had been their largest single sponsor until they parted ways in 2019, coinciding with the BSA's decision to let girls join. Hence why many of its policies are in step with religious conservative ideology. Though a lot has changed over the last 15 years or so, which includes the lifting of the ban on openly homosexual members, which went into effect in 2013. Suffice to say, over the last several decades, the BSA has been contending with its sullied reputation, which has at least partially resulted in its membership steadily dwindling since the turn of the century, and thus has been trying to find ways to distance itself from their extremely troubling past. A big policy and name change seems like a no-brainer. Whether you think those at the helm are making these changes as a result of a genuine desire to do what they believe is right by their community, or they are simply trying to distance themselves from a past mired by abuse and or mitigate the monetary toll of an 8-figure bankruptcy settlement, is up to you. The larger point I am making is that the argument that this decision was a byproduct of some ideological war against masculinity which aims to eradicate any and all male-only spaces doesn't hold all that much water, despite what some pundits and personalities want to impress upon you. But hold on, Mac, you are missing the point. Even if the narrative that the BSA was forced to allow girls by some progressive ideological campaign isn't true, regardless of why it occurred, it doesn't change the fact that, as a consequence of everything you just went over, young boys have once again lost a male-only space. And you know what? I think that's fair. Like women's only spaces are something that some women consider valuable, I think it is valid for some men to feel the same way about male-only spaces. Granted, I think most discourse surrounding male and female-only spaces is a complete show, but that shouldn't negate the fact that there are many who saw value in the BSA offering a space for only boys and lamented it being taken away. Except, now we come to the biggest misconception in regard to this controversy, which is that Scouting America still has gender-segregated troops. In 2019, when the change was made, the organization was still referred to as the Boy Scouts of America, and yes, girls were allowed admission, but it's not like everything immediately became co-ed. Boys and girls were still assigned to separate troops based on gender, which, now that they belong to the same organization, follow the same curriculum. There are linked troops, which is when a boys' troop and a girls' troop share a troop committee, but otherwise operate independently from one another. Now, starting in 2018, the Cub Scouts, which is the program for children 10 and under, did add a co-ed option. However, parents are still able to enroll their kids in boys-only and girls-only troops should they choose. And just this past year, Scouting America rolled out a pilot program meant to gauge the viability of co-ed troops for scouts aged 11 to 17. And, if successful, it is likely a co-ed option will be added in the future, while still retaining the option to join boy or girl-only troops. It should also be noted that the BSA has offered co-ed programs, namely exploring, venturing, and sea scouting, since the 1970s, so even this isn't anything all that new. Thus, I don't see how this has resulted in a male-only space being taken away. The option is still there for those who want the boy-only or girl-only experience, while still offering the co-ed option for others. But that's just me. You may still hold the belief that these changes were misguided and a different approach should have been taken. But at least now we can have a discussion based on a set of shared facts as opposed to misconceptions and false narratives. Nowadays, I usually stick to media analysis and only make videos on men's issues when it's about something that really grinds my gears. As to why I was driven to make this video, nothing makes me more irate than seeing online ideologues claiming they care about issues facing young men when, based on their inability or unwillingness to do even a shred of research, I suspect they are just using their plight to push some ulterior motive. What is so baffling about the pushback against these changes is that almost none of what I have found showcases how the boys themselves feel about these changes. From the little I could find on the likes of Reddit and elsewhere, it seems like it really has not been as big of a deal as many would try to make it seem. Many will claim they are fighting for the best interest of boys, yet at no point seem to actually care about what the boys themselves have to say. Their feigned concern just a proxy to push their own ideological viewpoints. Hell, you could even levy this criticism at the BSA themselves. Did they actually speak to Boy Scouts and get their input? I can't imagine they did. So, if you are a scout yourself, or have any insight on the effect that the change has had on boys in the Scouts or the organization itself as a whole, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments. If so many are going to use young boys and men as political props, the least we could do is give them some semblance of a fucking voice.